Forget pyramids, forget mummies, forget the postcard version of ancient Egypt. The real shocker. Their universe didn't start with a divine speech, a big bang, or even two lovers under a tree. Number, according to the Egyptians, everything began because their creator God handled things himself, literally. And they didn't whisper about it, they carved it in stone, painted it on temple walls, and celebrated it in public festivals. If this sounds like something your high school history teacher skipped over, trust me, they did. But today you're getting the uncut version of the origin story museums love to avoid. Picture it, the god Atum floating in an endless sea of chaos. No other gods, no humans, no animals, no anything. Just him, all alone, with nothing but his own divine powers. So what does he do? Well, according to Egyptian religion, he uses those powers in a very personal way. And from that single act, the first gods were born. Shu, the god of air, Tefnut, the goddess of moisture, and eventually everything else. This wasn't an obscure bedtime story, it was the creation myth. It was carved into pyramid walls, taught to priests, and celebrated openly. Here's the wild part. They didn't see anything shameful about it. Quite the opposite. It was the most sacred act imaginable. So sacred that one of the highest titles a woman could hold was God's hand, symbolically representing the divine creative force itself. Queens like Hatshepsut proudly claimed that title and had it etched into their temples. Imagine the Pope walking around with a title like that today. And these weren't secret little whispers in dark chambers. You can walk into places like the Temple of Karnak or Dendera right now and see scenes of Atum's self-generation displayed for worshippers. Tour guides might skip that part, but for the Egyptians it was front and center. Because to them, creation, life, and fertility weren't taboo topics. They were divine truths, worth celebrating as publicly as possible. If Atum was the cosmic spark, Min was the fireworks show that never stopped. Min wasn't some fringe figure hiding in dusty temples. He was one of Egypt's oldest and most important gods, worshipped for over 6,000 years. His specialty? Fertility. And the Egyptians didn't just pray to him quietly, they threw full-blown public festivals in his honor that would make modern Mardi Gras look like a church picnic. Here's how it went down. Every year, during harvest season, the pharaoh himself would lead a massive parade carrying Min's statue through the streets. And Min's statue, well, let's just say you could never mistake him for another god. He was always depicted with one very prominent, unmistakable symbol of fertility. Painted black to represent the rich, life-giving soil of the Nile Valley, Min stood tall, literally and figuratively, as a reminder of life's creative power. And then there was the lettuce. Yes, lettuce. Priests would carry mountains of the stuff alongside Min's statue, because when you cut it, it oozes a white sap that Egyptians saw as, let's say, symbolically appropriate. Women would line the streets, dancing and performing ritual gestures toward Min, asking for blessings in the form of healthy crops, healthy children, and a generally prosperous life. Foreign visitors didn't know what to do with themselves. Herodotus, the Greek historian, basically said, "I saw it, I believe it, but I'm not writing down all the details." Plutarch was equally shocked, describing the public rituals with the kind of polite horror you reserve for meeting your partner's overly affectionate relatives. But here's the thing, for Egyptians, none of this was scandalous. It was a religious duty. Temples dedicated to Min were everywhere, and tiny Min amulets were worn by men, women, and even children for protection and good fortune. Festivals weren't just for fun. They were believed to ensure the Nile would flood and the land would stay fertile. To the Egyptians, honoring life's creative power was just good common sense. If you think your family gatherings are complicated, ancient Egyptian royalty would like a word. Forget marrying into other noble houses or sealing alliances through strategic weddings. The pharaohs kept it all in the family. And I mean literally, brothers marrying sisters, fathers marrying daughters. Sometimes the same person could be your sibling, spouse, and co-ruler all at once. Family tree, more like a family circle. Why? Well, it wasn't just about power, it was a divine tradition. The most important love story in Egyptian mythology was between the gods Isis and Osiris, who also happened to be brother and sister. In their myth, love and loyalty ran so deep that Isis even reassembled Osiris's body after he was murdered just to conceive their son, Horus. So for the pharaoh, marrying a sibling wasn't just acceptable, it was emulating the gods. Take Tutankhamun. When DNA testing was finally done in 2010, scientists discovered his parents were full siblings. His own wife, also his half-sister, Cleopatra, married 2 of her brothers. Ramses II married several of his daughters. And this wasn't hidden away in palace gossip, it was proudly carved into temple walls. Titles like King's Sister, King's Wife were official and celebrated. Of course, there were consequences. Generations of intermarriage led to health issues, birth defects, and shorter lifespans. Tutankhamun himself walked with a cane at 19 and suffered from multiple conditions tied to inbreeding. Still, the logic was ironclad in their world. Keeping the bloodline pure preserved the pharaoh's divine essence, ensuring no mere mortal could claim the throne. Foreign rulers were baffled. Diplomatic letters survive from Babylonian kings politely declining Egyptian proposals, essentially saying, "Thanks, but we don't do that here." Egyptians, in turn, basically shrugged and said, "It's a divine matter, you wouldn't understand." So while modern royals pose for wedding photos, ancient Egyptian couples were celebrating sibling anniversaries like it was the most natural thing in the world. And in their eyes, it absolutely was. If you think modern birth control comes with strange side effects, wait until you hear what ancient Egyptian women were working with, and how shockingly effective some of it actually was. Forget pills, implants, or latex. These people were mixing crocodile dung with honey and shoving it where the sun doesn't shine. And yes, they did it on purpose. Here's the thing, it wasn't random. Crocodile droppings are alkaline, which creates a hostile environment for sperm. Acacia gum, another common ingredient, contains lactic acid, the same stuff used in some modern spermicides. Honey created a sticky barrier, plus it had antibacterial properties. It sounds medieval, but the science checks out. The Kahun gynecological papyrus from around 1800 BCE reads like a Bronze Age Planned Parenthood handbook. Recipes for contraceptives, instructions for timing applications, even ratings for effectiveness. One method mixed fermented dough with crocodile dung, another used lint soaked in acacia juice. They also experimented with sodium carbonate for a chemical block. And they weren't just preventing pregnancy, they understood fertility cycles. The Berlin Papyrus describes counting days after menstruation to track fertile windows. They even had a pregnancy test. Women would urinate on bags of wheat and barley. If the wheat sprouted, it meant a boy. Barley meant a girl. No sprouting, not pregnant. Modern science tested it and found it surprisingly accurate about 70% of the time. What's even more impressive is the social side of it. Egyptian women had no cultural concept of virginity. The word didn't exist. They could own property, initiate divorce, and demand alimony. Marriage contracts sometimes included clauses about satisfaction, both financial and otherwise. Compared to ancient Greece or Rome, where women's autonomy was practically non-existent, Egypt was a breath of fresh air. So while other ancient civilizations treated reproduction as a man's domain, Egypt gave women both the tools and the freedom to decide when and how to have children. Sure, their methods were a little earthy, but for a 4,000-year-old system, it wasn't just advanced, it was revolutionary. For most cultures, the afterlife is a serene retirement package. Clouds, harps, eternal peace. Ancient Egyptians, not so much. Their idea of paradise was basically eternal vitality, beauty, and the freedom to enjoy every pleasure imaginable, forever. They prepared for it like they were packing for a trip they were never coming back from, because they weren't. Tombs weren't just filled with gold and treasures, they were stocked with oils, perfumes, and very personal items to make sure the next life was just as lively as the current one. Tutankhamun's tomb, sure, it had chariots and jewelry, but it also had ointments and tools labeled specifically for maintaining vigor in the afterlife. They even had an ancient illustrated guidebook for eternal enjoyment, the Turin Papyrus. Long misunderstood as just art, Recent translations revealed it was basically an instruction manual for activities you could only pull off with the magical flexibility granted in the field of reeds, their heavenly paradise. Mummification itself wasn't just about preservation for looks. Certain techniques were intended to ensure the deceased had their full physical capabilities restored on the other side. And it wasn't only royals. Even middle-class officials went all in, decorating tomb walls with scenes of themselves celebrating, feasting, and enjoying divine company. For the Egyptians, death wasn't an end. It was a reset button to a better version of yourself. Eternal youth, eternal joy, eternal energy. You didn't just live once, you lived twice, and the second time you had no limits. For a civilization that embraced nearly every aspect of human vitality, the Egyptians did have one absolute line they wouldn't cross. And it might surprise you. When a high-status person died, their body wasn't sent straight to the embalmers. Instead, the family kept it at home for 3 full days. Not for mourning, not for ceremony, but to make sure natural decomposition had begun. As a deterrent to any inappropriate activity by the embalmers. Yes, it's grim, but it was practical. In Egypt's climate, 3 days was enough for nature to make the body significantly less tempting. Herodotus, the Greek historian, was so disturbed when he learned about it that he wrote an entire section detailing the practice and the reason behind it. And this wasn't paranoia. Papyrus court records describe real cases where embalmers were caught violating remains before the waiting period was established. One 19th dynasty case involved an embalmer named Paneb, whose punishment was the harshest possible. He was mummified alive. This waiting period became law. Contracts between families and embalmers included clauses forbidding early collection. Some families even hired guards to watch the body during those 3 days. The taboo was so strong that embalmers lived in their own communities, respected for their skills but kept socially distant. Once the body was mummified, it became sacred and safe. But in that brief limbo between death and preservation, Egyptians took no chances. It's a stark contrast to the openness in every other part of their lives, proof that even the most liberated culture had boundaries. You've probably walked past an Egyptian obelisk in Rome, Paris, London, or New York and thought, cool monument. In reality, it's a 3,000-year-old symbol of divine creative power. For Egyptians, architecture wasn't just design. It embodied their beliefs about life, regeneration, and the forces that kept the universe going. Obelisks caught the first rays of sunrise, marking creation's moment, and stood in pairs as cosmic gatekeepers to temple doorways symbolizing rebirth. Pylons represented the horizon's mountains, columns bloomed with lotus and papyrus for eternal growth, and sacred lakes mirrored creation's waters. Temples aligned with the sun, filling sanctuaries with light on sacred days, and some chambers amplified chants so it felt like the gods themselves answered. They didn't just speak of creation, they built it into every stone, every doorway, every sunrise shadow, and those meanings still echo, even if most visitors never notice. So what does this tell us? Ancient Egypt wasn't just pyramids and pharaohs. It was a culture that lived and died celebrating the forces that make life possible. They carved into stone what we still treat as taboo, gave women rights, openly honored fertility, and blended religion with science. They thrived for over 3,000 years while we still argue over basic health education. Maybe they weren't the strange ones. Maybe we are. Next time you see an obelisk or walk through a museum, remember the truth they lived by. If this blew your mind, subscribe and comment with the part that shocked you most.